Here's mud in your eye. That's the title of our message today. How many of you have ever heard a sermon on here's mud in your eye? I hadn't either. And I'll have to say that this is probably one of the most challenging messages I've ever had to put together. And it's really quite simple and beautiful when you think about it. But the passage that we're looking at today, which is really the entire ninth chapter of the Gospel of John, verses 1 to 41, and I know that's a long reading, but it's a complete story, and you really need to read the whole thing to get the message that God has for us. So let's go ahead and read that, and then you'll get the understanding of where I came up with here's mud in your eye, okay? Verse 1, now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And when he had said these things, he spat on the ground and made clay with the saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. And he said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. Therefore the neighbors and those who had previously seen that he was blind said, is not this he who sat and begged? Some said, this is he. Others said, he's like him. He said, I am he. Therefore they said to him, how were your eyes open? Excuse me. And he answered and said, excuse me. And he answered and said, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and I received sight. And they said to him, where is he? And he said, I do not know. Verse 13, they brought him who formerly was blind to the Pharisees. Now it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight. And he said to them, he put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was division among them. They said to the blind man again, what do you say about him because he opened your eyes? He said, he is a prophet. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. And they asked him, saying, is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? His parents answered them and said, we know this is our son, and that he was born blind, but by what means he now sees, we do not know, or who opened his eyes, we do not know. He is of age, ask him. He will speak for himself. They really stood up for him, didn't they? His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, he is of age, ask him. So they again called the man who was blind and said to him, give God the glory. we know this man is a sinner. He answered and said, whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, and I love this, that though I was blind, now I see. Then they said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered them, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? Then they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from. The man answered and said to them, why, this is a marvelous thing that you do not know where he's from, yet he has opened my eyes. Now, we know that God does not hear sinners. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered and said to him, you were completely born in sins, and are you teaching us? And they cast him out. Here comes the good part. Jesus heard that they had cast him out. And when he had found him, he said to him, do you believe in the Son of God? I might break up and cry. He answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I might believe him? And Jesus said to him, you have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you. Then he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. And Jesus said, for judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be made blind. Then some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these words and said to him, are we blind also? And Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say, we see. Therefore, your sin remains. I find this to be a very, very touching story. Now, Here's Mud in Your Eyes may sound like a strange title for a sermon, but it is an accurate description of a miracle Jesus performed on a blind man. Here's Mud in Your Eye is a common toast for a drink among friends. However, here it describes a miracle perhaps in what might be considered to be undignified terms. But that's not the point. The first point of this incident shows us that Jesus meets people where they are in life. I really love that thought. Jesus meets people where they are in life. This man was blind. He'd been blind all of his life. He was of age, which means that he was probably in his 30s, blind, sitting outside the temple, begging him. And Jesus meets him right where he is. Some people feel that they have to do all kinds of things to make their lives right before they can come to Jesus. But thank God, Jesus meets us where we are, in the condition which we are. And Lord, He is there to meet us. The second point is that Jesus is willing and able to help people with the challenges they are facing in life. He meets you where you are, whatever challenge you have in life. He is willing and able to help you with that challenge. And the third point is that Jesus is free to use any means He chooses to resolve a person's situation. It's up to Him how He takes care of it. You don't get to make that decision. He makes that decision. So, as we read the story, we see that it is full of pathos as we follow the man in this story, as his healing causes him more trouble that seems to be so unreasonable. Jesus was leaving the temple. He had just been involved in a tense verbal altercation with the Jewish leaders in which he tells them plainly that he is the Son of God. And these leaders were about to stone Jesus. But Jesus was able to leave the temple, and in the process of going out, he met this blind man. In spite of the fact that Jesus had almost been stoned to death, his disciples see this man in the way, and they stop to ask Jesus a deep theological question. Just a minute. This is absurd. The Jewish leaders were looking for rocks to throw at Jesus, and he is leaving the temple, avoiding rocks being thrown at him. And on the way out, this blind man is there, and the people around him, his disciples, say, "Hey, Jesus, I've got a question for you." Okay? Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Now, does that make any sense in the situation? You know, that just shows us that sometimes religious people get obsessed with religious thinking, and they don't look at religious living or spiritual living. They're more interested in this religious question. And Jesus now shows them that their question misses the point. It actually comes from religious intolerance and serves to justify inaction when God would have us step in and help a person in need. And Jesus turns the situation around so they can see what is on the backside of the picture. Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. That's what's going on here, guys. You missed the point altogether. In what Jesus says, we see that God takes the responsibility for the man's blindness. Now, he did not cause the blindness. Rather, he allowed a natural circumstance to take place so that the man was born blind. Now, some people might charge God with cruelty in allowing such. But notice, God had a purpose for this birth defect. God had a purpose. Some maybe 30 years when that child was conceived in his mother's womb, God says, I have a purpose. That DNA is not lining up correctly, and I know he's going to be born blind, but I've got a purpose. I'm going to show the world something because of this. And you know, this is going to be written down in the Gospels so that all the people in future generations will know the power of God and the purposes of things that happen in life. God intended to reveal himself in this defect in a way that is totally undeniable. You can't deny that it was God that made this man get his sight back. Okay? So, from this, we must learn that in birth defects, injuries, and upsets in life, that God is still God. And he has a purpose to work through these things. Now, the parents of this man were heartbroken when he was born blind. And he himself lived his life up to this time handicapped and rejected by society. And there was no expectations of his circumstance ever changing. And now, in what looks like a chance encounter, the man happens to be in a place where Jesus is passing by. Was this an accident? Or was this really purposed by God? Why did he go to the temple that day and sit in that spot to beg? And what caused those Jewish leaders in the temple to want to stone Jesus and rush him out of the temple? Right at this very moment, God working both ways, boom, right to this very moment in time. Jesus now proves the compassion of God in what looks like a totally random meeting. From this event, we see that God does have appointed times and specific circumstances where he intends to meet people and offer them what he knows they need. As Jesus was answering his disciples, he was in the very process of spitting on the ground and making mud. Did you catch that? They asked him the question, spits on the ground. He answered it, but he's making mud on the ground. Okay? He smears the mud on the man's eyes and tells him to wash himself in the pool of Siloam. Did you catch that? There's no evidence of healing with his eyes covered in mud. Jesus just put mud on his eyes. Jesus did not take the man to the pool. He had to find it on his own. He was blind and his eyes were covered with mud. And Jesus says, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. Jesus didn't even take him there. Imagine the challenge of that man. Okay? This is a lesson in trust. We must trust what Jesus tells us and obey without the evidence. And friends, it is only that kind of trust that makes the evidence come to pass. How many of you have ever encountered a situation like that in your life? You have a situation that just looks impossible. And God says, do this, go here, make this choice. And you say, but it can't work out. He says, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. You have to take that first step and do what he says for the answer to come. You see, the man's obedience allowed the miracle to take place. Jesus did the miracle, but it was necessary that the man obey so that the miracle could happen. Verse 7 says that he came back seeing. He went there, he washed, and mud fell off his eyes. He could see. And he came back to that spot, and he could see. While this follows the sentence where Jesus tells the man to go to the pool, from what follows, we see that Jesus was no longer there. Okay? Jesus had left. But he comes back to this place. And when he comes back there, he encounters neighbors that he knew that knew that he was blind. And they are surprised that he can see. Some thought it was just a man that looked like him. But he says, no guys, hey, it's me, it's really me. When they finally see that it is the blind man, they ask the obvious question, how were your eyes opened? To which he answers, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes. Wow. That seems totally ridiculous, doesn't it? Made clay and anointed my eyes, and you can see. So, where is Jesus now? That's what they want to know. Where is Jesus now? And notice, I sense some sadness in the man's voice as he tells the people, I don't know. I don't know. he came back hoping to find Jesus and say, hey, I can see. But instead, he gets all these questions thrown at him. And where's Jesus? He said, I don't know. I think his heart's broken. He wants to see Jesus. Well, the miracle is dismissed as nonsense by the religious leaders. The neighbors immediately take the man to the Pharisees to evaluate this miracle that's gone on. They are the pros. They're the people that can speak to these things. Well, they immediately dismiss it, and they start an argument with a man who had been healed. That is just really out of place. Start an argument with a man. Hey, this is the Sabbath. And they say Jesus cannot be from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. And then notice that some of the neighbors argued, hey, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? If this guy is a sinner, like you're saying, how could he do a miracle like this? They had more spiritual perception than these religious leaders. Perhaps there was some trickery going on. So the Pharisees call the man's parents to verify whether or not this is their son who was indeed born blind. Now, his parents really do not want to be involved. Okay? They admit he is their son, but they put the responsibility of what happened back on him. You see, they were not willing to be thrown out of the church just because of a miracle. We have far too many wishy-washy Christians today who will not stand for the truth, accept the truth, and let God be God. The former blind man recounts how he regained his sight and confesses that he really does not know who this Jesus is, but it still remains that he is the one that healed him. He refuses to accept that Jesus is some kind of fraud. Instead, he asserts that Jesus has to have come from God, otherwise he could not have healed him. And in spite of the reality of this miracle and the man's testimony, and rather than giving him credibility, they simply write him off, saying, you were completely born in sins. Wow. Verse 34 ends telling us, and they cast him out. Now, he did not realize it at the moment, but this was the best thing that happened to him that day, even better than being healed of his blindness. Being thrown out of church is the best thing that ever happened to him? Yes. Why? You have to go on and read the rest of the story. We see that Jesus finds him. Remember, he came back from the pool of Siloam hoping to see Jesus, but he couldn't. Then he goes through this whole ordeal and is thrown out of the church. And now Jesus finds him. It got to touch your heart. And Jesus asked the man a simple question. Do you believe in the Son of God? Hurt by being cast out of the church because of the miracle, he answers, who is he that I may believe in him? And Jesus sees him, says to him, you have both seen him, thank God, because he now is a sight. And it is he who is talking with you. And in humble adoration, he simply says, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. Some of the Pharisees saw this, and they spouted back in criticism, are we blind also? To which Jesus replies, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say, we see, therefore your sin remains. Here we have two different encounters with Jesus. The blind man who received both sight and faith on this day. And then those who were supposed to have spiritual sight and spiritual understanding, but were blinded by their pride and their sin. So, which encounter would you have with Jesus today? The blind man or those who say that they see? Has something come into your life by chance that is troubling you? It may be that Jesus is through this thing encountering you to bring about a miracle you need in your life. Or are you so self-assured, so self-directed that you cannot recognize this thing as a God moment in your life? The choice really is yours. Now, let's distill this whole story down to the point. What is it about? What do we see? The point is, let God be God and do things His own way. Let God be God and do things His own way. What you do not understand may solve the issues in your life. We don't like that. We like to be on top of things. We like to know what's happening, why, how do we fix it? But maybe there's no way to fix it. And you don't understand that this thing that's happening to you right now may be something that will really solve a bigger issue in your life. And what God does for you may confuse or maybe even offend some other people. But God can use even that rejection to draw you closer to God, closer to Jesus. So be humble. Be humble. While you're in your situation and Jesus says, here's mud in your eye. Go wash, and I will take care of that situation in my own way. Amen.